Right now, somewhere just behind your forehead, a small, quiet office is running a prediction. It doesn't wait for information to arrive from your skin. It doesn't wait for your fingers to move. It looks ahead, the way a person humming a familiar song already knows the next note before their throat produces it. Your brain is drafting a forecast of what your own body is about to feel, moments before that feeling exists. This is happening constantly, in the background, without ceremony. It happened when you shifted your weight to get comfortable a few seconds ago. It's happening now, in the space between one breath and the next, as your ribs expand and your brain quietly notes, yes, this is expected, this is mine, nothing to report. Most of the time, this forecasting service is so efficient that you never notice it exists at all. It only reveals itself in strange, specific corners of experience. One of the strangest is the fact that you cannot tickle yourself the way another person can tickle you. Say that plainly for a moment and let it sit there, because it really is odd if you look at it directly. Take your own fingertips and draw them lightly along the underside of your forearm, or across your palm, or along the sole of your foot if you can reach it comfortably where you're lying. You'll feel something, a faint stirring, a whisper of sensation, maybe even something you could describe as ticklish in a technical sense. But it almost certainly won't make you laugh. It won't make your shoulders jump or your stomach clench the way it would if someone else, a sibling, a partner, an old childhood friend, crept up and did the exact same thing, at the exact same pressure, along the exact same patch of skin. The touch is identical. The nerve endings receiving it are the same ones, firing in the same pattern, sending the same electrical signals up the same pathways toward the same brain. And yet, the experience on the inside is nowhere close to the same. One version is almost nothing. The other can make you shriek, arch your back, beg for it to stop, while somehow also laughing so hard you can barely speak. This is the quiet paradox we're going to spend our time with tonight, turning it over slowly, the way you might turn a smooth stone in your palm in the dark, feeling its shape without needing to see it. Not to solve it in a rush, not to arrive at some tidy headline fact you can repeat at a dinner party, but to sit with it patiently, layer by layer, the way scientists themselves have had to sit with it across more than a century of careful, sometimes accidental, sometimes delightfully strange experiments. Because it turns out that this small childhood mystery, the kind of thing a 7-year-old might ask while giggling on a couch, connects to some of the deepest questions we have about how a brain builds a sense of self at all, about where the boundary sits between you and the world, about how your nervous system decides, thousands of times a day, what counts as something happening to you versus something you are doing. Let's start with the forecasting idea again, because everything else tonight will rest gently on top of it. Imagine you are about to close your hand into a fist. Before your fingers curl, before the tendons pull tight, before your muscles even finish contracting, your brain has already sent out something like an internal memo. Researchers sometimes call this an efference copy, though you don't need to hold on to that term particularly tightly tonight, since we're not here to memorize vocabulary, only to follow an idea as it unfolds. The simple version is this. Whenever your brain sends a command out to your muscles telling them to move, it also quietly keeps a copy of that command for itself. It's a bit like a person sending a letter, and, almost without thinking, also jotting a note in their own private journal about what the letter said, and when it was sent.
That private copy lets the brain anticipate the consequences of the movement before the consequences actually arrive. So when your hand curls into a fist, your brain isn't just sitting back passively, waiting to be informed by your skin and your muscles about what just happened. It has already predicted, with impressive precision, exactly what sensation should follow. It knows roughly how your palm should feel as your fingers press against it. It knows roughly what your joints should report back about their new position. And when the real sensory information finally does arrive, traveling up through the nerves at its own steady biological speed, your brain compares the actual feeling against the forecast it already made. If the two match closely, if reality lines up neatly with prediction, something quite remarkable happens. The brain quietly turns the volume down. It treats the sensation as old news, already accounted for, not worth much attention. This is not laziness. It is efficiency of a very elegant kind, because a brain that had to fully process every single sensation caused by its own movements, at full volume, all day long, would very quickly become exhausted by the sheer noise of simply being alive in a body.
Think about the sound of your own footsteps as you walk down a familiar hallway. You hear them. In some technical sense, your ears are absolutely receiving that sound, and yet you rarely truly listen to them, rarely find them startling or interesting, because your brain predicted them the instant before they happened and filed them away as expected. Now imagine someone else's footsteps, unfamiliar, unpredicted, echoing behind you in that same hallway at night, same category of sound, arguably even quieter. But your attention snaps to it immediately, because there was no internal forecast prepared for it in advance. Nothing dulled it. Nothing told your brain in advance, don't worry, this is just you. This same quiet mechanism seems to sit at the very center of the tickling puzzle. When you move your own fingers toward your own ribs, your brain has already, milliseconds earlier, drafted a forecast of exactly how that touch should feel, where it will land, how firmly, in what direction, at what speed. By the time the actual sensory signal from your skin arrives, it's arriving into a system that already knows what to expect, and so the intensity gets gently dialed down. The signal isn't erased or ignored completely, which is why you can still feel something faint when you touch your own skin. But it has been softened, anticipated, absorbed into the ongoing story your brain is telling itself about what it, personally, is doing on purpose. Someone else's hand carries none of that advanced paperwork. There is no efference copy for another person's muscle movements, because your brain never sent the command in the first place. It has no forecast prepared, no memo filed, no expectation waiting to soften the blow. So when unfamiliar fingers move toward that same sensitive patch of skin along your ribs or the back of your knee, the sensation arrives at full, unfiltered strength, and often with an element of pure unpredictability layered on top, since another person's timing and pressure and direction rarely match a script you could have anticipated even if you tried. The nervous system treats this as genuinely new information, worth attending to closely, and in certain particularly sensitive areas of skin, that heightened, unpredicted attention seems to be exactly what tips a mere touch over into something closer to helpless, involuntary laughter. It's worth pausing here, gently, before we go any further, to notice something almost tender about this whole arrangement. Your body, it turns out, is constantly keeping a kind of quiet ledger of what belongs to you and what doesn't. Not through some grand philosophical debate happening in your conscious mind, but through this humble, practical,
almost bureaucratic process of prediction and comparison, running continuously beneath your awareness, sorting sensations into two simple piles: mine, already expected, safe to soften, or not mine, unexpected, worth a closer look. This sorting process began working long before you had language, long before you could have explained it to anyone, and it will keep working tonight as you drift, adjusting to every small shift of your own limbs, every soft readjustment of your blanket, filtering out the sensations caused by you, so that your attention can rest more easily on everything else. There is more to uncover here than this single mechanism, though. Prediction alone, it turns out, doesn't fully explain everything about why laughter enters the picture at all, or why some people seem more ticklish than others, or why the areas of skin that respond most strongly aren't necessarily the ones with the densest concentration of nerve endings. There's a social layer to this too, an old evolutionary layer, tangled up with trust and vulnerability, and the strange history of how scientists first tried to study something so slippery and personal in a laboratory setting. We'll ease into that next, slowly, the way you might turn from one side to the other, beneath the covers, still comfortable, still unhurried, simply settling into a new angle from which to keep looking at the same soft mystery.
Let's slow down, now, and sit with the sensation itself for a while, because tickling is not really one feeling. It only wears one name in everyday conversation, the way cold covers everything from a cool breeze on your neck to the ache of snow underfoot. Scientists who spent their careers on this small, strange corner of human experience eventually found it useful to split tickling into two separate kinds, and once you know the difference, you may notice it in your own skin tonight, faintly, harmlessly, as you settle in. The first kind is the lighter one. It has a name that sounds almost invented for a bedtime story, though it comes from old Greek roots meaning to scratch or to gnaw. Kinesmesis. This is the feeling of a hair brushing against your arm in the dark. It's the sensation of an insect landing somewhere on your leg before you've even looked down to check. It's the faint drag of a wool blanket, edge against bare skin, or the ghost of a feeling you get when a thread from your shirt shifts against your collarbone. Kinesmesis doesn't usually make anyone laugh. It doesn't require another person at all. It can happen from a breeze, from clothing, from a spider you'll never actually see, and most people describe it not as delightful or funny, but simply as itchy, mildly urgent, something to be resolved. Your hand moves to scratch it, or to brush it away, almost before you've consciously decided to do so. There's very little joy in it, and very little social meaning either. It sits closer to an itch than to a joke, and in fact, some researchers who study the skin's sensory pathways suspect it may share circuitry with the itching sensation more broadly, the same ancient, practical alarm system that once helped animals notice and remove small crawling threats before they became bites or stings. The second kind is the one most people picture when they hear the word tickling at all, and it goes by a name that sounds almost comically serious for something so playful: gargalesis. This is the deep, repeated, often unbearable tickling that happens along the ribs, in the soft crease behind the knee, under the arms, sometimes at the sides of the neck or the arch of the foot, depending on the person. Gargalesis is not faint. It does not whisper. It tends to arrive with pressure, rhythm, and repetition, fingers pressing and releasing in quick succession, and it is this kind of touch, almost exclusively, that produces the helpless laughter people associate with being tickled. You may remember it from childhood, an older sibling's hands finding the exact soft spot along your ribs, your body twisting away, even as some other, stranger part of you kept laughing, unable to stop, caught somewhere between genuine delight and something closer to distress. That contradiction, laughing while also desperately wanting the touch to end, is one of the strangest and most reliably reported features of gargalesis, and it's part of why researchers have never been fully comfortable calling it simple pleasure. It helps, maybe, to think of nismesis and gargalesis as sitting at different points along a spectrum of unexpected touch, rather than as two entirely separate categories with a hard line between them. On one end, you have that faint, insect-like crawling, resolved with a scratch, forgotten in seconds. On the other, you have the rhythmic, repeated, often overwhelming touch that produces laughter, squirming, and sometimes real difficulty catching your breath. Most everyday brushes against your skin, the collar shifting on your neck, a stray eyelash falling against your cheek, live comfortably on the nismesis end. Being tickled by a determined sibling or a persistent friend, fingers finding the ribs again and again, lives on the gargalesis end. But there's a wide, quieter middle ground too, that in-between feeling when someone traces a finger slowly along your forearm and you can't quite decide if it tickles or just feels pleasant, a sensation that seems to shift depending on your mood, who's doing the touching, and how relaxed or alert you happen to be in that particular moment. That variability is worth noticing because it tells us something important. This isn't a fixed physical property of certain patches of skin, the way skin color or the density of hair follicles might be fixed. It's closer to an event, something that happens between a particular touch and a particular nervous system in a particular state, at a particular moment. The same touch, in the same location, might produce laughter one evening and almost nothing the next, depending on how tired you are, how safe you feel, whether you were expecting it even a little. This is part of why, historically, tickling proved to be such a frustrating subject for scientists trying to study it under controlled laboratory conditions. You cannot simply apply a fixed amount of pressure to a fixed patch of skin and expect a fixed, repeatable laugh, the way you might measure a reflex, like the knee jerk, with a small rubber hammer. Tickling refuses to behave that consistently. It depends on context in a way that few other physical sensations do, which made it, for a long stretch of the 20th century, something serious researchers tended to sidestep, treating it as a curiosity rather than a subject worthy of careful study. There is also, even now, genuine debate about how cleanly this two-part division actually holds up. Some researchers who have spent years working directly with ticklish sensation have questioned whether kinesmesis and gargalesis are truly two distinct systems in the nervous system with separate pathways and separate purposes, or whether they are better understood as two ends of one continuous process, differing mainly in intensity, rhythm, and the amount of pressure involved, rather than reflecting any deeper biological split. The itch-like light touch and the rib-shaking deep touch may share more of their underlying wiring than the old two-category model suggests, with the difference in outcome, mild irritation on one end, uncontrollable laughter on the other, arising more from how strong
and how rhythmic the touch is than from which distinct system is switched on. This is one of those places in the science of the body where the tidy textbook diagram, two clean circles labeled with their Greek names, is more a convenient teaching tool than a settled biological fact, and where the messier, more honest answer is that scientists are still working out exactly where one kind of touch ends and the other begins, and whether the boundary is even the right question to be asking in the first place. What does seem clear, across most of the research on this, is that gargalesis, the laughter-producing kind, almost always requires another person, or at least the sense that another presence is involved. This is one more thread we'll follow later, but it's worth letting it settle quietly here for now. Unlike nismesis, which a stray hair or a loose thread can trigger with no one else around, the deep, rib-shaking tickle seems tied, in some fundamental way, to the presence of another mind, another set of intentions, doing the touching. Even the memory of being tickled by someone else, brought vividly to mind, tends to feel different from imagining a bug crawling along your arm. One calls up warmth, or teasing, or the particular texture of a specific relationship. The other calls up little more than the itch itself. For now, though, let the distinction rest lightly. You don't need to sort every sensation on your own skin into one category or the other as you drift off tonight. The softness of the sheet against your ankle, the faint pressure of the pillow beneath your ear, these are simply the ordinary, unremarkable touches your nervous system has already filed away as familiar, nothing urgent, nothing worth laughing about, nothing worth much attention at all. It's only the occasional unexpected shift, a foot slipping to a cooler patch of the bed, that might register, faintly, as something closer to that first, lighter category, quickly noticed, and just as quickly forgotten. From here, it's worth turning to why gargalesis so often centers on certain places on the body, and not others, the ribs, the underarms, the soles of the feet, and what that peculiar geography might be quietly telling us.
Before we can even ask why the ribs and the underarms seem to hold some special claim on ticklishness, it helps to slow down and follow the actual physical journey a touch takes, from the moment it lands on skin to the moment it becomes something you might call a sensation at all. It's a longer journey than most people imagine, and no single stop along the way does the whole job. It begins, always, in the skin itself. Your skin is not a single sheet of uniform material, however smooth it might feel under your own fingertips. It's closer to a densely woven fabric embedded with many different kinds of sensors, each tuned to notice something slightly different. Some respond to steady pressure, the way a hand resting on your shoulder can be felt continuously for as long as it stays there. Others respond only to change, to the onset and release of a touch, and go quiet almost immediately if the touch doesn't move. Still others are built to notice vibration, the kind of fine, rapid fluttering you'd feel from a phone buzzing in your pocket, or, as it happens, from a fingertip trailing lightly and unpredictably along the inside of your arm. These receptors have technical names: Merkel cells, Meissner corpuscles, Pacinian corpuscles, Ruffini endings, names borrowed from the 19th century anatomists who first identified them under early microscopes, squinting at slices of skin no thicker than a shadow. But you don't need to hold on to the names. What matters is simply this: even before a tickle becomes a tickle, it is already a chorus, several different types of receptors firing in different patterns, none of them individually equipped to say, "This is ticklish." They are only reporting raw physical facts: the speed of a touch, its lightness, whether it's moving or still. From these receptors, The signal travels inward, along peripheral nerves, thin cables of living tissue that thread through your limbs like wiring, routed through the walls of an old house. This part of the journey is not instantaneous. A signal from your foot has farther to travel than a signal from your cheek, and while the difference amounts to only a few dozen milliseconds, that gap is long enough that certain researchers have wondered whether it plays some small role in why some areas feel more reactive than others. Nothing conclusive there, only a passing curiosity worth mentioning, and then setting back down. What is well established is that these nerve fibers carry their signals up to the spinal cord, entering through small doorways along its length called dorsal roots. And it's here, in the spinal cord itself, that the first real sorting begins. The spinal cord isn't merely a passive relay, a length of cable carrying information upward without comment. It does its own preliminary editing, a kind of rough triage, deciding which signals seem urgent enough to prioritize, and which can be bundled together and sent along more slowly. This is part of why a sudden sharp pain can make you flinch before you've even had a conscious thought about it. The spinal cord has already begun organizing a response before the brain has weighed in. A light, playful touch doesn't get that same emergency treatment. It travels upward, along a comparatively unhurried route, still fast by any ordinary measure, but not urgent in the way pain is urgent. From the spinal cord, the signal continues up into the brainstem, and then to a small, deep structure called the thalamus, which serves, more or less, as a switching station. Almost every kind of sensory information passes through the thalamus, on its way to becoming something you're aware of. Sound, sight, touch, all of it funneled through this one central hub before being distributed to the appropriate regions of the cortex. It's tempting to imagine the thalamus as indifferent, a mere junction box, but it appears to do some shaping of its own, adjusting the strength of certain signals depending on what else is happening in the body at that moment, how alert you are, how anxious, how tired. This is one small reason the same touch can feel different, depending on your state. Why a light brush against your neck might barely register on a calm afternoon, but feel startling and overly loud late at night when you're tired and your nerves are, in a sense, listening more closely. From the thalamus, signals related to touch are routed to the somatosensory cortex, a strip of brain tissue running roughly from ear to ear across the top of the head, organized in a way that mirrors the body itself. This mapping was worked out in careful detail in the mid-20th century, largely through the work of the Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield, who, while operating on patients undergoing surgery for severe epilepsy, gently stimulated different points along this strip of cortex, and asked his patients, who remained conscious throughout, what they felt. A touch here, and the patient reported a sensation in the hand. A touch there, and it was the face. Through this patient, painstaking work, Penfield and his colleagues assembled what's often called the sensory homunculus, a distorted little map of the human body laid out across the cortex, distorted because it isn't drawn to the scale of the actual body, but to the scale of how densely each region is wired with sensory receptors. The lips and fingertips take up an enormous amount of cortical territory, far more than their small physical size would suggest, while the back, the shoulders, the broad stretches of the torso are represented by comparatively little. This is part of why a fingertip can distinguish two closely spaced points touching the skin while the same 2 points, pressed against your back,
might feel like a single vague touch.
The brain simply has more resolution, more finely tuned attention, dedicated to some parts of the body than others. But even reaching the somatosensory cortex isn't the end of the story, and this is really the heart of what makes tickling so resistant to any tidy explanation. Activity in that strip of cortex tells you where you were touched, and roughly what kind of touch it was, fast or slow, light or firm, moving or still. It does not, by itself, generate laughter, or squirming, or that particular blend of pleasure and desperation so many people describe. For that, the signal has to reach other regions entirely, areas involved in attention, in emotional processing, in anticipation, and, this part is easy to overlook, in your ongoing sense of who else is present and what they might do next. The anterior cingulate cortex, a region tucked deep in the brain's midline, appears to become active during tickling, and it's a region also associated with the processing of pain and with conflict, moments when the brain is, in effect, receiving mixed signals that don't resolve neatly into a single clear category. This may be part of why ticklish laughter so often carries that odd double quality. Pleasure shot through with something that resembles distress, a person laughing while also twisting away, saying stop, while, in some strange contradiction, not fully wanting the touch to end either. And then there is attention, which turns out to matter more than almost anything else in this whole chain. A touch that arrives when you're expecting it, when you can see the hand approaching and track its path, tends to feel far less ticklish than the same touch arriving as a complete surprise. This is part of the reason self-tickling struggles to work. Your own hand's movement is never a surprise to you, since your brain has already been given advance notice of exactly where it's going and how it will feel once it arrives. We'll return to that particular mechanism in more detail shortly, because it turns out to involve one of the more elegant pieces of internal bookkeeping your brain quietly performs, moment to moment, almost entirely outside your awareness. For now, simply notice how far this signal has traveled, from a single patch of skin, through nerves, through the spinal cord's quiet triage, through the thalamus's shifting adjustments, up into a folded map of your own body laid out across the cortex, and outward still further into regions concerned with emotion, expectation, and the felt presence of another person. No one stop along that path holds the whole answer. The ticklish feeling is less like a single note struck on a single key, and more like something closer to a chord, several systems sounding together, and it's really only in that combination that laughter, or squirming, or the sudden gasp of a foot pulled away begins to make any sense at all. It's this same layered arrangement that helps explain why certain parts of the body seem so much more sensitive to a ticklish touch than others, which is where we can turn next, slowly, without any need to rush toward an answer tonight. Let's slow down for a moment on that word, prediction, because it turns out to be the real hinge of this whole mystery, and it deserves to be turned over carefully, the way you might turn over a smooth stone in your palm before setting it down again. Every time you move a hand, lift a foot, or curl a finger to scratch an itch, your brain isn't simply issuing a command and then waiting, passively, to find out what happened. That would be a strange and inefficient way to run a body. Imagine if the only way you learned your arm had moved was by watching it move, the way you'd watch someone else's arm, with no advance notice at all. You would be perpetually startled by your own actions. Reaching for a glass of water would carry a small jolt of surprise each time your hand entered your field of view. Nobody lives like that, And the reason nobody lives like that is because the brain, quite cleverly, keeps a copy. When a motor command leaves the parts of your brain responsible for planning and initiating movement, it doesn't travel alone. Alongside the actual instruction sent down through the spinal cord to the muscles, telling them to contract, to lift, to reach, a second signal branches off and stays behind, circulating internally. This internal duplicate has a name that sounds almost bureaucratic, efference copy, and the phrase is a fairly literal description of what it is. Efferent signals are the ones traveling outward from the brain to the body, out to the muscles that will do the actual moving. So an efference copy is exactly that, a copy of the outgoing order, filed away internally the instant it's issued, before the real movement has even had time to begin. This idea has a history worth pausing on, since it didn't arrive all at once. Back in the 1860s, the German physicist and physician Hermann von Helmholtz was puzzling over a curious fact about eyes. If you gently press on the side of your own eyeball with a finger, the world outside appears to jump, to swim briefly to one side. But when you move that same eye normally, using your own eye muscles, the world stays perfectly still, even though the eye is rotating in its socket, just as it was when you pushed it with your finger. Helmholtz reasoned that the difference had to lie not in the eye itself, but somewhere further back, in the brain's own bookkeeping. When the movement comes from a voluntary command, he suggested, the brain is somehow informed in advance, and it uses that advance notice to cancel out the expected shift in the visual scene. When the movement comes from an external push, no such notice is given, and so the shift registers as real, as the world itself moving, rather than the eye. It would take almost a century for that intuition to be given a more precise scientific shape. In 1950, two German researchers, Erich von Holst and Horst Mittelstaedt, were studying insects, watching how flies managed to tell the difference between the world moving around them and their own turning within a stationary world. They proposed that the nervous system generates exactly this kind of internal duplicate, a signal they called, in German, Efferenzkopie, sent inward, at the same moment the outward command is sent to the muscles. That same year, working independently on the other side of the world, the American neuroscientist Roger Sperry was studying fish, specifically how a fish's eyes track its own swimming movements without becoming confused by the passing scenery, and he arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion, describing what he called corollary discharge. The terms differ slightly in their emphasis, efference copy leaning toward the idea of a literal duplicate of the motor command, corollary discharge leaning toward the idea of a signal sent to inform other brain regions of what's about to happen, but both describe essentially the same quiet act of internal notification. Your brain tells itself, in effect, before your body has finished telling your muscles. Once that inward-facing copy exists, the brain can use it to do something genuinely remarkable, which is to build what researchers now generally call a forward model. This phrase, forward model, is borrowed partly from engineering, where it refers to a system that predicts the future state of something based on the commands currently being sent to it. Think of it a little like the way a thermostat might anticipate, in a very simple sense, how warm a room will become given how long the heater has been running, rather than only reacting after the temperature has already changed. Your brain, faced with the much richer problem of controlling a body, does something considerably more sophisticated, but the underlying logic rhymes. Given a particular motor command,
The forward model estimates, almost instantly, what the sensory consequences of that command are likely to be. If you're about to lift a coffee cup, the forward model doesn't only predict the movement of your arm, it predicts the changing pressure against your fingertips as the cup's weight settles into your grip, the faint pull against your shoulder, even the small sound the cup might make sliding across the table before it lifts off entirely. This matters enormously for something as basic as catching a ball, or typing a sentence, or walking across a dark room without stumbling, because sensory feedback from the body is, in purely physical terms, slow. Signals from your skin, your joints, your muscles, all have to travel upward through nerves at a finite speed, arrive at the spinal cord, pass through relay stations, climb finally into the cortex, and by the time all of that has happened, a moving body has already moved further still. If the brain waited for every scrap of real sensory feedback before adjusting a movement, your actions would lag behind themselves, a little like trying to have a conversation over a satellite connection with a noticeable delay, where every reply arrives just slightly out of step with what was actually said. The forward model closes that gap. It gives the brain an estimate of where the body should be and what it should be feeling right now, an estimate available immediately, well before the real sensory report has had time to travel home. And here is the detail that will matter most for the specific puzzle of tickling, so it's worth letting it settle for a moment, rather than rushing past it. Because the forward model produces a prediction of the exact sensory consequences of a movement, your brain isn't just anticipating that something will happen, it's anticipating, in fairly fine detail, what that something will feel like. Not merely that your fingers will touch your own ribs, but roughly how much pressure will be involved, the timing of the contact down to a fraction of a second, the particular path the fingers will travel, the rhythm if the movement repeats. When your hand actually does make contact, the real sensory signal traveling up from your ribs arrives, and is compared, almost like a kind of quiet audit, against the prediction that was already sitting there waiting for it. If the two match closely enough, the brain treats the sensation as accounted for, expected, already known in advance, and it dampens the response accordingly.
This is why your own touch on your own skin tends to feel muted, familiar, almost administrative, compared to the very same touch delivered by someone else's hand, arriving without any matching internal forecast to soften it. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this entire system operates before conscious thought even has a chance to weigh in. You don't decide, in any deliberate sense, to expect the touch of your own fingers on your own ribs. The prediction forms automatically, generated the instant the motor command is issued, running in parallel with the movement itself, rather than trailing along behind it. In a very real sense, part of your brain always knows what your hand is about to do to the rest of your body, a fraction of a second before it happens, and that quiet foreknowledge is woven into nearly everything you do without your ever noticing it's there. What makes this whole arrangement worth dwelling on tonight, rather than simply accepting as a tidy explanation and moving on, is that it isn't actually as airtight as it might first sound, and the places where it strains a little, where the prediction and the real sensation don't line up quite as neatly as this description suggests, turn out to be nearly as revealing as the mechanism itself. Picture, for a moment, a small laboratory tucked into a psychology building in London, sometime in the late 1990s. The setup is almost comically modest. There's a chair, a participant seated in it, and a simple mechanical device built to press a soft foam pad against the palm of one hand. Nothing dramatic. And yet this unassuming little machine became the instrument that let researchers pull the self-tickling question apart, with real precision, rather than simply speculating about it the way people had for centuries. The logic behind the experiment was elegant, almost deceptively simple. If the reason you can't tickle yourself is that your brain predicts the sensation and cancels it out in advance, then that cancellation should depend on the prediction being accurate, not just present. And predictions, unlike reflexes, have some flexibility in them. They can be nudged. They can be made slightly wrong on purpose. So the researchers built a way to let a participant's own hand movements control the foam pad, but with a twist. Sometimes the pad would touch the palm at the exact moment the hand moved, and sometimes there would be a small delay first, a fraction of a second, so the touch arrived slightly after the movement that was supposed to produce it. This is worth pausing on, because it's a strange thing to construct. The participant was, in a sense, still tickling themselves. Their own hand movement was still the cause of the sensation. Nothing external had been introduced. And yet, by inserting a short lag, somewhere in the neighborhood of a fraction of a second, between the action and its consequence, the researchers found that the sensation started to feel noticeably more ticklish. Not dramatically so, not as if a stranger had suddenly done the touching, but measurably more ticklish than the version with no delay at all. And the effect grew as the delay grew longer, up to a point. A very short lag produced a small increase in ticklishness. A longer lag, say around 300 milliseconds, produced more. It was as if the sensation was becoming less and less yours, the further it drifted from the moment your brain had predicted it would occur. Think about what this means for a second, turning it over slowly. The hand, doing the touching, was still the participant's own hand. The decision to move it was still their own decision. The only thing that changed was timing, a gap so brief you'd struggle to consciously notice it in ordinary life, shorter than the blink of an eye, shorter than the time it takes to say a single syllable out loud. And that tiny gap was enough to partially unlock the ticklish response that self-produced touch normally keeps sealed away. It tells you something important about how finely tuned this predictive system actually is. It isn't just checking whether you caused the touch. It's checking whether the touch arrived exactly when and how you expected it to, down to a resolution far finer than conscious awareness usually operates at. The researchers didn't stop with timing. They tried something else too, which was to introduce a spatial mismatch instead of, or alongside, a temporal one. In this version, the mechanism was rigged so that a participant's hand movement, instead of producing a touch in the expected location, produced one slightly offset from it, on a different part of the palm than the motion itself would suggest. Once again, the effect was the same in spirit. The greater the mismatch between where the touch was predicted to land and where it actually landed, the more ticklish, the more surprising, the sensation became. A touch delivered exactly where expected, at exactly the moment expected, stayed muted and administrative, as we said before. A touch that drifted even slightly away from that prediction, in either time or space, started to slip past the brain's dampening system and register instead as something closer to unexpected contact from outside. There's a nice way to hold this idea in your mind as you drift, using something more familiar than laboratory foam pads. Think of the way you can walk down a staircase in your own home, in the dark, without really thinking about it, your foot finding each step by a kind of internal muscle memory built from prediction. Now imagine someone quietly removed one step, or made it very slightly taller or shorter than the others, without telling you. Your foot would still land somewhere. The staircase would still be,
in every sense, the same staircase you know by heart. But that one small mismatch between what your body expected to feel underfoot and what it actually felt would jolt you, however briefly, in a way that every other correctly predicted step did not. The tickling experiments are working with something similar, just at a much smaller, much faster scale, measured in milliseconds and millimeters instead of stair heights. What these robotic delays and spatial shifts really demonstrate, when you step back from the specific numbers, is that the brain's dampening of self-touch isn't a blunt, all-or-nothing switch. It behaves more like a finely graded comparison, constantly checking the incoming sensation against the prediction and adjusting its response to match how well the two line up. Perfect agreement produces maximum dampening, the sensation reduced to something almost background, easy to ignore. As the agreement gets worse, whether through a delay in timing or a shift in location, the dampening loosens its grip, and more of the raw, unfiltered sensitivity comes through. Ticklishness, in other words, isn't simply present or absent, depending on who's doing the touching. It exists on a kind of sliding scale that tracks the accuracy of the brain's own forecasting in real time. This also helps explain why the classic advice people sometimes give, something like moving your hand in an unpredictable pattern to try to surprise yourself into feeling ticklish, has a grain of truth buried in it, even if it rarely works especially well in practice. True unpredictability is hard to manufacture from the inside, because the very act of deciding to be unpredictable is itself something your brain is aware of and factoring into its forecast. A robot, or another person, doesn't share your intentions, doesn't have access to the motor plan sitting inside your own head, and so its actions carry a kind of genuine uncertainty that your own actions, however erratic you try to make them, generally lack. The London experiments essentially built an artificial version of that gap, using precise, controllable delays and offsets, small enough to be interesting scientifically, but real enough to matter to the nervous system's prediction machinery. It's also worth noting, gently, that these findings, however carefully measured, describe a general pattern found across groups of participants, rather than a fixed rule for every single nervous system in every circumstance.
Individual sensitivity to touch varies quite a bit from person to person, and factors like attention, mood, and even how relaxed someone is in the moment can shift how strongly this dampening effect shows up on any given try. Some people report their own touch feeling almost completely flat regardless of small delays, while others notice the difference quite readily. Science, especially science built on careful but modestly sized laboratory studies like these, tends to describe tendencies and averages rather than absolute guarantees, and that's worth remembering even as the overall pattern holds up well across many replications since. What lingers most from these experiments, though, at least for tonight's purposes, is the image of that little foam pad machine, quietly proving something that would be almost impossible to test any other way. It showed that the difference between a touch that tickles and a touch that doesn't isn't really about who is doing the touching, not in the deepest sense. It's about whether the sensation matches what was already, invisibly, predicted. Change the timing by a sliver of a second, shift the location by a matter of millimeters, and the very same hand, moving in the very same way, starts to feel just a little more like someone else's. And once you know that the system can be nudged this way, through nothing more than small mismatches in timing and space, it becomes natural to wonder what happens when those mismatches grow larger still, or when the prediction system itself, for one reason or another, doesn't line up with the body's actions quite the way it does for most people. Let's slow down for a moment and sit with a question that might already be forming somewhere in the back of your mind. If a prediction has to be made, and made quickly, and made with enough precision to cancel out a sensation before it even fully arrives, then something in the nervous system has to be doing the timing. Something has to be functioning almost like a conductor, holding the score of an upcoming movement and comparing it, note for note, against what the senses report back. That conductor, or at least one of its most important members, is a strange, densely packed structure tucked beneath the back of the brain, folded over on itself so many times that if you unfurled its surface, it would stretch out far longer than you might expect for something that fits so neatly at the base of the skull. This is the cerebellum, and if you've never given it much thought before tonight, that's understandable. It doesn't get the same attention as the more famous wrinkled surface of the cerebral cortex, the part most people picture when they imagine a brain. But in the story of why you can't tickle yourself, the cerebellum plays a role that researchers have circled back to again and again. For a long time, going back to the 19th century, the cerebellum was thought of mainly as a movement structure, something involved in coordination and balance, important for walking steadily or catching a ball without stumbling. Patients with cerebellar damage often struggle with smooth, well-timed motion, their reaching becoming jerky, their steps uneven, as though the fine adjustments that usually happen invisibly beneath conscious awareness are no longer being made correctly. That much has been established through many decades of clinical observation and careful study. But somewhere in the later parts of the 20th century, researchers began asking a quieter, more specific question. If the cerebellum helps produce smooth movement, might it also be involved in predicting the sensations that movement is about to cause? This is where the story shifts gently from what's firmly established to what's reasonably inferred, and it's worth pausing to mark that shift clearly, because the two are not quite the same thing, even though they can feel similar when a story is being told smoothly. We know, with a good deal of confidence, that something in the brain generates a prediction about self-produced touch, and that this prediction dampens the resulting sensation. That part rests on decades of carefully designed behavioral experiments, the kind involving foam pads and small mechanical delays, the kind that show up again and again in different laboratories with different volunteers. What is less certain, though still well supported, is exactly which structures do this work, and how they do it, and how they talk to one another. The cerebellum is one of the leading candidates, but leading candidate is a different thing from proven answer. Still, the evidence pointing toward the cerebellum is worth sitting with, because it fits together in an oddly satisfying way. Neuroimaging studies, the kind that measure blood flow, changes as a rough proxy for neural activity, have repeatedly found that cerebellar regions become active during self-generated touch, and that this activity seems to track with the timing of the movement itself, almost as though the structure is anticipating the sensory consequence before it lands. Researchers have proposed that the cerebellum might be forming something like an internal simulation, a quiet, fast, background prediction of what a movement is about to feel like, built from a copy of the motor command
sent out just before the movement even happens.
This proposed copy has a name in the scientific literature, sometimes called an efference copy, and the idea is that the brain doesn't just send instructions to the muscles and wait to see what happens. It also sends a parallel signal inward, to itself, a kind of preview, so that when the real sensation arrives, it can be compared against the preview almost instantly. It's a bit like the way a musician who has played a piece hundreds of times can often sense, even with their eyes closed, whether a note is about to be slightly early or slightly late, not because they're actively thinking about it, but because their body already knows the shape the music is supposed to take. The prediction and the outcome sit so close together in time that any small mismatch stands out immediately, almost like static on an otherwise clear signal. If the cerebellum is doing something similar with touch, generating that preview and comparing it against what actually arrives, then a well-timed match would allow the resulting sensation to be quietly dampened, filed away as expected, unremarkable, already accounted for. A poorly timed mismatch, on the other hand, would let more of the sensation through because it no longer matches what was anticipated. And this returns us, gently, to the delayed touch experiments from earlier, the ones where shifting the timing by a fraction of a second let a touch feel just slightly more ticklish. Under this framework, that shift isn't just an accident of timing, it's a small failure of prediction, a tiny gap between what the cerebellum expected and what the skin actually reported. But even here, it would be a mistake, and a somewhat common one in casual retellings of neuroscience, to treat the cerebellum as though it works entirely alone, as if it were a single, dedicated tickle suppression center sitting quietly in the back of the head. Brains rarely work that way, and this particular process seems to be no exception. Other regions appear to be involved as well, including areas of the cortex associated with processing touch itself, and regions further forward in the brain associated with monitoring and comparing sensory signals against expectations more broadly. Some researchers have suggested that structures involved in planning movement also contribute to this predictive process before the movement even begins, feeding information forward into the system so that by the time the touch actually happens, several different regions have already, in a sense, been told what to expect. Untangling exactly how much each of these regions contributes and how they coordinate with one another in real time remains an active and still evolving area of study, one where different research groups sometimes emphasize different pieces of the puzzle. This matters because it's easy, especially late at night, when a story feels satisfying, to reach for a single tidy explanation. The cerebellum predicts the touch, and that's why you can't tickle yourself. End of story. But real nervous systems tend to resist that kind of tidiness. It's more accurate, and honestly, more interesting, to think of the cerebellum as an important contributor to a broader, distributed process, one voice in a small committee rather than a lone decision maker. The committee includes structures for generating movement, structures for anticipating its sensory consequences, structures for comparing prediction against reality, and structures for weighing just how much attention that final sensation deserves. The cerebellum seems to specialize in the fine-grained timing, the kind of split-second precision that lets a prediction line up closely enough with an actual touch to cancel much of its intensity. But precision alone doesn't explain the whole experience. Something still has to decide what a mismatch means and how strongly to respond to it, and that decision-making likely involves regions well beyond the back of the skull. There's also a subtler point worth sitting with here, one that researchers themselves have been careful about. Much of what's known about the cerebellum's role in this process comes from indirect evidence, patterns of brain activity correlated with behavior, patients with cerebellar damage showing altered responses to self-touch, timing relationships that fit neatly with a predictive model. Correlation and careful inference can build a compelling picture, and in this case, they genuinely have, supported across many separate lines of research that happen to point in a similar direction. But a compelling picture, built from indirect evidence, is still not quite the same as watching the mechanism directly, note by note, as it happens. Neuroscience, especially neuroscience of something as fast and quiet as a canceled sensation, often has to work this way, piecing together a likely explanation from many partial glimpses rather than one clean, uninterrupted view. And so the cerebellum sits at the center of this part of the story, not as a single answer, but as a patient, precise timekeeper working alongside other regions whose exact contributions are still being mapped out. Which raises another question worth carrying gently into the next part of tonight's exploration. What happens to this whole system, this quiet cooperation between prediction and movement, when the timing itself begins to drift for reasons that have nothing to do with foam pads or laboratory delays at all? It helps, actually, to step back from tickling for a moment and notice how strange it is that this single mechanism turns out to be everywhere. Once you start looking, self-generated cancellation isn't some rare quirk reserved for underarms and the soles of feet. It's quietly running in the background of nearly everything you do, and one of the clearest places to see it is not in your skin at all, but in your eyes. Try this gently, without straining, just as a thought. When you move your eyes to look from one side of a room to the other, the image on your retina sweeps across in a blur, far too fast for you to consciously register, and yet you don't experience the world smearing past you the way it would if someone shook a camera. The room stays put. The picture feels stable, continuous, as though your eyes had simply jumped from one still frame to the next without anything happening in between. This is sometimes called saccadic suppression, and it depends on the same basic logic as the tickle response. Just before your eyes move, your brain already knows the movement is coming because it issued the command. It uses that advance notice to briefly dampen your visual processing during the sweep itself and to quietly adjust its expectations so that the sudden shift in the image is read as your own doing rather than the world lurching around you. If someone were to gently move your eyeball for you, say, by pressing lightly on the eyelid, the world would seem to jump, because that motion wasn't predicted. But a self-initiated saccade produces no such jolt. The prediction arrives just in time to smooth the disruption away before it reaches awareness. There's something worth pausing on here, in the quiet of thinking about it. The eyes are moving many times each second, all day, every day, and yet almost none of that motion becomes part of your conscious experience. You could go your whole life without noticing how often your gaze darts around a page or a face, because your brain has learned so early and so thoroughly to erase the evidence of its own machinery. It isn't hiding anything from you out of caution. It's simply doing what it always does with self-generated events, filtering out the parts it can already explain so that attention is free for what it cannot. Footsteps work in a similar, though not identical, way. If you have ever walked down a hallway at night, sock feet against old wooden floors, you may have noticed that the creak and shuffle of your own steps barely register, even though the sound is happening right there, close to your ears, over and over. Meanwhile, the faint creak of someone else's step in the next room can snap your attention awake instantly. Some of this difference comes from meaning. Other people's footsteps might signal something worth attending to, while your own carry no such news. But some of it also comes from prediction, in a way that echoes what happens with touch and with vision. Your brain anticipates the rhythm and timing of your own gait. It knows roughly when a footfall will land, how loud it should be, what pitch of creak to expect from that particular stretch of floor you've walked 1,000 times before. When the sound matches the prediction closely enough, it fades toward the background, not erased entirely, but quieted, treated as expected noise rather than urgent information. Change the rhythm, though, stumble unexpectedly, or step somewhere unfamiliar, and the sound often becomes noticeable again, because the prediction no longer fits well enough to explain it away. Chewing offers a particularly good example, partly because it's so relentless. Every meal produces a steady percussion of sound, transmitted not just through the air, but through the bones of your own skull, which conducts sound differently than air does, and often more efficiently for certain frequencies. This is part of why your own chewing can sound almost thunderous if you record it and play it back later, compared to how faint and forgettable it felt while eating. In the moment, though, that same loud, bone-conducted crunching rarely bothers you. You can chew through an entire meal while carrying on a conversation, hardly aware that a small storm of sound is happening just behind your teeth. Predictive suppression is thought to play some role here too, damping a sensation that is both extremely frequent and extremely well anticipated, since you know, roughly, when you're about to bite down and about how loud that particular food will be against your molars. The famous exception, of course, is when someone else is chewing nearby. Their chewing carries none of that predictive cushioning for you, and for many people, it becomes strangely, disproportionately hard to ignore, precisely because your brain has no advanced model of their jaw movements to lean on. All of this begins to explain something else that might have crossed your mind once or twice, usually in a moment of idle curiosity rather than serious concern. Why it's so difficult to surprise yourself. You cannot really sneak up on your own senses, not in the way another person can sneak up on you. If you try to startle yourself by suddenly clapping your hands near your own ear, you know it's coming, obviously, since you're the one deciding to do it. There is no moment of not knowing for the system to be caught off guard by. Surprise, at its core, seems to depend on a mismatch between what was predicted and what actually happened, and when you are both the predictor and the one carrying out the action, that gap almost never opens wide enough to produce the jolt of genuine surprise. People sometimes try clever workarounds, asking a friend to trigger something on their behalf with unpredictable timing,
or setting up a delay so long that they forget exactly when to expect it. Both tricks work by reintroducing the very unpredictability that self-generated action tends to erase. And this brings us, gently, to one of the more disarming cousins of this whole phenomenon, the strange unfamiliarity of hearing your own recorded voice. Nearly everyone has had this experience at some point, whether from an old voicemail greeting, a video taken at a birthday party, or a recording made for some entirely mundane reason and then played back unexpectedly. The voice that comes out of the speaker often sounds thinner or higher, or somehow not quite like the voice you thought you had. This isn't really about prediction in the same sense as tickling or eye movements, though it shares the family trait of expectation versus reality. When you speak, you hear your own voice through two different pathways at once. Sound travels through the air to your ears, the same way it would for anyone listening to you, but it also travels through the bones and tissues of your own head, a route that tends to emphasize lower frequencies and gives your voice, to your own ears, a fuller, deeper quality than it actually has out in the world.
Recordings capture only the air-conducted version, the version everyone else has been hearing all along, stripped of that bonus resonance from your own skull. The mismatch between the voice you expect, built from a lifetime of hearing yourself through bone and air together, and the thinner voice on the recording, can feel oddly personal, almost like meeting a stranger who happens to share your exact words. What ties all of these examples together, tickling, eye movements, footsteps, chewing, the near impossibility of self-surprise, even the surprise of your own recorded voice, is this recurring theme of the brain constantly comparing what it expected against what it received, and adjusting the felt intensity of experience accordingly. Some of these adjustments happen through fine motor prediction, some through long familiar acoustic patterns, some through a lifetime of anatomical quirks, like bone conduction, that most people never think about until a recording catches them off guard. The mechanisms differ in their details, sitting in different corners of the brain, running on different timescales, but underneath the differences, there's a shared logic quietly doing its work, moment after moment, mostly without your notice. Which leads naturally to a related question, one that tonight's exploration hasn't touched yet, whether animals, in their own varied and curious ways, experience anything like this same quieting of self-generated sensation, or whether this particular flavor of self-knowledge turns out to be something more distinctly human. The unpredictability at the heart of being tickled by someone else is worth sitting with for a while, because it turns out to be doing more work than it first appears. When another person reaches toward your ribs or trails a finger along the sole of your foot, your nervous system is not simply registering a touch. It is trying, in real time, to answer a cluster of questions it cannot fully resolve. Where exactly will the touch land? When exactly will it arrive? How much pressure will it carry? And perhaps most elusive of all, what does the other person intend by it? A hand can move toward you in a way that looks almost identical, whether it means to tickle, to tap you on the shoulder, to brush away a piece of lint, or to catch you as you stumble. The visual information alone often cannot settle the matter, and so your brain is left holding several possibilities open at once, weighing them, waiting for more evidence, right up until the moment of contact, and sometimes for a beat or two afterward. This is different in kind from the situation you find yourself in when your own hand approaches your own skin. There, the brain has privileged access to a kind of internal memo, sent out the instant a movement is planned, describing where the hand is headed, how fast, and with what force. That memo, sometimes called an efference copy in the language of motor neuroscience, lets the sensory system prepare a fairly precise forecast, and forecasts that turn out to be accurate get quietly discounted, the way a familiar hum in your apartment fades from awareness because your brain has learned it carries no new information, but another person's hand comes with no such memo. You are not privy to their motor plan. You can only watch, listen, and guess, and guessing is a fundamentally noisier business than knowing. Think about the last time someone came up behind you with the clear intention of startling or tickling you, perhaps a sibling in childhood, perhaps a partner sneaking up while you stood at the kitchen counter. There is often a stretch of seconds, sometimes many seconds, during which nothing has happened yet, but your body already seems to be responding as though something has. Shoulders creep upward, breath catches slightly, muscles along your sides tense in a kind of preemptive brace. This is anticipation doing its work, and it is not a trivial side effect. It is arguably a central part of why tickling by another person can feel so much more intense than any attempt to reproduce the sensation on your own. The nervous system, denied a precise forecast of when and where and how hard, compensates by heightening its general readiness, casting a wider net of vigilance across the skin that might be touched. And a wider net catches more than it needs to, so when the touch does arrive, it can land on a system already primed to overreact. There is a useful comparison to be made here with how people respond to sounds. Researchers studying the startle reflex have long noted that an unexpected loud noise produces a much stronger flinch than the same noise when a person has been told exactly when it will occur. Warn someone that a burst of static will play through their headphones in exactly 10 seconds, count down aloud, and the flinch shrinks, sometimes dramatically, compared to the same sound arriving without any warning at all. Knowing the timing changes the felt intensity of an experience even when the physical stimulus itself is completely unchanged. Tickling seems to draw on something similar, except that with tickling, certainty is almost never available, because another person is, by nature, an unpredictable source. Even someone who tells you they are about to tickle you, and where, tends to fudge the timing a little, waiting a beat longer than expected, or moving faster than announced, whether on purpose or simply because human movement is not a metronome. That residual uncertainty, even in a supposedly telegraphed tickle, may be part of why forewarning rarely eliminates the response entirely, the way it does with a beeping tone in a lab. Location adds its own layer of unpredictability. The skin is not uniformly sensitive, and certain areas, the ribs, the underarms, the soles of the feet, the back of the knees, carry a much higher density of the touch receptors that seem especially good at triggering that particular blend of laughter and unease we call ticklishness. But which of those spots will be targeted, and in what order, is rarely obvious in advance. A hand approaching your side might be headed for your ribs, or might veer toward your hip, might feint one way and go another, and the ambiguity of the trajectory means your brain cannot settle on a single predicted target the way it might if you were tickling yourself, where the hand's destination is, by definition, wherever you have decided to send it. Multiply that spatial uncertainty by uncertainty about timing and uncertainty about pressure, whether the touch will be a light brush or a firmer poke, and you get a compound forecast with far more open variables than the nervous system typically has to juggle for a touch on the body. Prediction, in this context, is not a single yes or no question about whether contact will happen. It is closer to trying to solve several intertwined equations at once, each with its own margin of error. Then there is the matter of intention, which is perhaps the most human of these variables and the hardest to reduce to anything mechanical. A touch from a close friend, during a moment of playful teasing, carries different emotional weight than an identical touch from a stranger, and the brain seems to fold that social context into its response as well. Studies on tickling have repeatedly found that the relationship between the person tickling and the person being tickled matters. That trust and familiarity change not just whether the experience feels pleasant or unbearable, but how strongly the body reacts in the first place. This suggests that the uncertainty at play is not purely a matter of physical prediction, of guessing where a finger will land, but also a matter of social prediction, of gauging whether this particular unpredictable act, coming from this particular person, is safe. A ticklish reaction from a trusted sibling during a light-hearted game can dissolve into genuine laughter, while the same fingers, wielded by someone whose intentions feel uncertain or unwelcome, can produce something closer to real distress, wriggling and pulling away that has little of the playful sparkle people usually associate with being tickled. The nervous system, in other words, is not just asking where and when, it is also asking whether this is friend or foe, game or threat, and folding that assessment into how intensely it braces. All of this helps explain a detail that puzzles people who think about tickling for the first time as adults: the fact that ticklishness in humans often peaks in childhood and can fade, at least somewhat, with age. Children spend enormous amounts of time in playful physical contact with parents, siblings, and friends, contact that is inherently unpredictable in exactly the ways described here: sudden, varied in target and pressure, laced with social meaning about play and safety and closeness. It may be that repeated exposure to this kind of unpredictable but ultimately safe touch gradually recalibrates the nervous system's baseline vigilance, the way a person who grows up near train tracks eventually stops flinching at the sound of a passing freight car, even though a first-time visitor to the same house might startle badly at 3 in the morning. The tickle response never disappears entirely for most people, but its edges can soften with a lifetime of learning that this particular kind of unpredictable contact tends to resolve safely, again and again, until the body's alarm system quiets its forecast just slightly, without ever managing to eliminate it altogether, because true self-generated tickling remains, as established earlier tonight, essentially impossible to produce. It is worth noticing, too, that anticipation itself has a strange relationship with time. The seconds before a tickle can feel simultaneously very short, because the whole episode is over quickly, and oddly stretched, because the body is so keyed up during the build-up that ordinary time perception seems to slow, the way the last moments before a roller coaster's first drop can feel like they last far longer than a clock would confirm. That subjective stretching of anticipatory time may itself be doing some of the amplifying work, giving the nervous system more perceived opportunity to build tension before the actual sensory event ever arrives. And once you notice how much of the ticklish experience lives in that anticipatory window rather than in the touch itself, it becomes easier to see why laughter so often begins before contact is even made, why a hand simply raised in a familiar, threatening arc toward a childhood sibling can provoke squirming and giggling before a single finger has touched skin at all.
which brings the conversation naturally toward the laughter itself, and toward a curious distinction researchers have drawn between the laughter of being tickled and the laughter of something genuinely funny, two sounds that can seem, on the surface, remarkably alike.
Let's set that distinction aside for a moment and sit instead with a broader question, one that researchers who study laughter have circled for well over a century without quite landing anywhere final. Why does tickling produce laughter at all? Not squirming, not wincing, not the flat grimace of ordinary discomfort, but laughter, that particular explosive, rhythmic, breathy sound that otherwise shows up around jokes and shared glances and the release of tension after something frightening turns out fine. It is a strange pairing, if you stop to really look at it. A touch that the body treats as a potential threat, urgent enough to trigger reflexive flinching and defensive limb movement, somehow also triggers one of the most recognizably social and positive sounds a human being can make. That mismatch, threat response wearing the clothing of joy, is part of what has kept this question alive for so long. One family of explanations reaches back toward play and toward the deep evolutionary usefulness of practicing certain movements before they are ever needed in earnest. Watch two young mammals of almost any playful species wrestling in a yard or a den, puppies rolling over each other, otters tumbling in shallow water, human children play fighting on a living room floor, and you will notice something that looks almost exactly like the choreography of real combat, except slowed down, softened, punctuated by breaks, and often accompanied by sounds that seem designed to signal, "This is not real, we can stop any time, nobody is actually in danger here." Some researchers have proposed that tickling fights, the kind that happen between parent and small child, or between siblings, or even between certain primates, may function as a low-stakes rehearsal space for exactly the skills a young body will eventually need for real physical defense, learning where the vulnerable places on one's own body are, learning how quickly a limb can move to protect the ribs or the throat, learning to read another creature's intentions from the angle of an approaching hand. Practiced this way, in laughter and safety, rather than in genuine danger, the lesson gets absorbed without the cost of an actual injury, the way a fire drill teaches an evacuation route without anyone needing to experience a real fire first. This idea connects naturally to the observation that the parts of the body most reliably ticklish, the ribs, the underarms, the neck, the soles of the feet, the belly, are also, not coincidentally, some of the most anatomically vulnerable parts of the body, places where major arteries run close to the surface, where soft tissue sits largely unprotected by bone, where a real attacker, animal or human, would be most likely to aim. It is a small detail, but a suggestive one, the way a night sky full of stars is suggestive of pattern even before anyone has drawn the constellations. The overlap between ticklish zones and vulnerable zones has led some researchers to wonder whether the whole reflex evolved, at least in part, as an early warning system tied specifically to bodily defense, a reflex that happens to route itself, in playful and controlled circumstances, through laughter instead of alarm. But this is exactly the kind of hypothesis that deserves to be held gently rather than gripped tightly, because for every piece of suggestive overlap, there are gaps the theory does not fully close. If tickling exists purely to protect vulnerable areas, why does it fade so reliably with unfamiliarity? Why does a stranger's touch on the ribs often produce more discomfort than laughter, when a threat response, if that is truly what is happening, might be expected to intensify rather than soften in the presence of someone unknown?
Why do some people report almost no ticklishness at all in areas that are, anatomically, just as exposed as anyone else's? The evolutionary story explains a pattern without fully explaining its exceptions, and a good scientist tends to notice exceptions the way a careful listener notices a held note that sits ever so slightly outside the chord. A second, related family of explanations moves away from combat rehearsal and toward something gentler, the strengthening of social bonds. Laughter, after all, is deeply social in almost every context where it occurs. People rarely laugh much when alone, even at things they find genuinely funny. Laughter multiplies in the presence of others, spreading almost the way a yawn does, catching from one person to the next around a room. Tickling nearly always happens between people who already know each other, parents and children, siblings, close friends, romantic partners, and it appears to reinforce the closeness of exactly those relationships. A parent, tickling an infant, produces not just laughter, but sustained eye contact, reaching, a kind of delighted engagement that researchers who study early bonding find genuinely significant, not so different in function from the games of peekaboo that appear across cultures with remarkable consistency, games that also rely on a predictable rhythm of tension and safe release. Under this view, tickling is less about rehearsing self-defense and more about rehearsing trust, a repeated, low-stakes demonstration that this particular person, hands moving toward your most vulnerable places, can be allowed close, without real danger following. Every successful round of laughter without harm becomes a small deposit into a shared account of safety, evidence, collected again and again across childhood, that this relationship is one where vulnerability does not lead to real hurt.
It is a lovely idea, in some ways, that a body's most defensive reflex might double as one of its most intimate social tools, the same nervous system wiring pressed into service for two purposes that on paper seem almost opposite, guarding the self and also opening the self to another person. Observations of tickling in other primates lend some further, if still incomplete, support to these social framings. Researchers studying chimpanzees and other great apes have long noted vocalizations during rough and tumble play that share acoustic features with human laughter, a panting, breathy rhythm produced during wrestling and tickling among young apes in particular. This has led some scientists to argue that the roots of human laughter itself may reach back millions of years to a shared ancestor whose playful physical contact already produced something laughter-like long before language, long before jokes in any sense a person today would recognize existed at all. If true, this would mean tickling did not arrive alongside human humor, but actually preceded it by an enormous span of evolutionary time, with laughter first serving a physical, social, bonding function among playing juveniles, only later becoming available, in humans, for the entirely different purpose of responding to a clever turn of phrase or an unexpected punchline. It is a compelling picture, and yet, again, worth resisting the urge to treat it as fully settled. Comparing a chimpanzee's panting vocalization to a human child's giggle requires a certain amount of interpretive judgment about what counts as similar enough to be called the same phenomenon, and researchers who study animal behavior are often careful to note how easy it is to project human categories onto behavior that may be doing something related, but not identical. The fact that both sounds occur during play and both seem to signal something like enjoyment or safety is meaningful, but meaningful is not the same as proven, And the deeper question of whether these vocalizations share not just a surface resemblance, but an actual evolutionary lineage, remains, honestly, an active and unresolved area of study, the kind of question that tends to generate careful, hedged academic papers rather than confident textbook answers. What all of this leaves a person with, drifting through these ideas at the end of a long day, is less a single tidy explanation and more a small constellation of partial ones, each illuminating something real about why tickling exists, why it produces laughter, why it seems to matter so much between people who trust each other, and why none of them, taken alone, manages to explain the whole phenomenon cleanly. Play rehearsal, vulnerability signaling, social bonding, deep evolutionary roots shared with other primates. Each idea holds a piece of the picture, the way several separate keys might each open one drawer of the same old wooden desk without any single key managing to open every drawer at once. And it's that same desk, in fact, that the next stretch of this exploration returns to, this time from a slightly different angle, looking not at why the response might have evolved, but at what happens when it doesn't work quite the way it does for most people at all. Consider, for a moment, two children in the same family, tickled in more or less the same way by the same parent, on the same rainy afternoon. One dissolves into helpless laughter, kicking her socked feet against the couch cushions, gasping for the parent to stop while also, somehow, leaning closer. The other stiffens, pulls his arms in tight, and says, in a voice that is not playing along, that he does not like it. Same house, same hands, same general gesture, and two entirely different experiences. This is one of the quieter puzzles, tucked inside the larger puzzle of tickling, and it deserves its own slow unfolding, because the tendency, when something doesn't match the general pattern, is to assume there must be something wrong with the person who deviates from it. But variation itself seems to be a basic feature of how ticklishness works, not a malfunction of it. Age is one of the more reliably documented sources of difference, even if the details remain somewhat fuzzy at the edges. Infants, interestingly, do not typically laugh at tickling in the earliest months of life, even though the withdrawal reflex, the flinch and pull away, can be present quite early. The laughter tends to arrive later, often somewhere in the second half of the first year, layered on top of a physical response that was already there. This suggests, tentatively, that the reflexive and the social parts of tickling may develop on somewhat separate timelines, with the body's defensive wiring coming first, and the more relational, laughter-producing layer arriving once a baby has had more practice reading faces, more practice trusting the particular humans who loom over the crib, making funny sounds. Young children, by many informal and some formal accounts, often seem to be at something like a peak of ticklishness, though peak here is doing a lot of work, since it is difficult to separate genuine heightened sensitivity from the simple fact that young children are more often tickled in the first place, more often on the receiving end of playful adult attention aimed squarely at the ribs and the soles of the feet. Ticklishness does seem, anecdotally and in some limited research, to soften somewhat in adulthood, though whether this reflects a real change in the nervous system's response or simply a change in how often adults find themselves in tickling situations at all is genuinely hard to untangle. A person who has not been tickled in 15 years might report, upon being tickled again, unexpectedly, that the sensation feels just as overwhelming as it ever did, which argues against much fundamental change
even as the broader cultural pattern suggests adults laugh at this particular game less often, simply because they play it less often. Attention turns out to matter in ways that are almost comically direct, given the subject. A person deeply absorbed in a task, reading, solving a problem, watching something gripping, often reports being less ticklish in that moment than they would be sitting idle. This lines up with a broader pattern seen across many kinds of touch sensitivity, where attention functions something like a spotlight, and sensations outside the beam of that spotlight register more faintly than sensations sitting directly inside it. Distraction, in other words, is not just a trick for getting through an unpleasant tickle unscathed. It may reflect something real about how the nervous system allocates its limited processing resources, moment to moment. This is also, incidentally, one reason surprise attacks tend to land so much harder than tickling someone who is braced and waiting, since a person caught off guard has their attention parked somewhere else entirely, and the sudden touch arrives, with nothing competing for the spotlight. Trust, which earlier sections touched on in terms of the general relationship between tickler and tickly, also varies quite a bit from person to person in how much of it is required before tickling feels good, rather than simply invasive. Some people seem to need very little reassurance, delighting in tickling, even from someone they've just met at a party, treating it as harmless fun, without much internal negotiation. Others require a great deal more, finding tickling from even a close friend or partner to feel uncomfortably exposing, unless the mood, the setting, and their own state of mind align just right. Neither disposition is more correct than the other. It may simply reflect broader differences in how comfortable a given person is with losing a bit of control over their own body and their own laughter in front of someone else, since tickling does ask, even in its gentlest form, for a small surrender of composure, and some people find that surrender delicious, while others find it faintly alarming, no matter who is doing the tickling.
Mood folds into all of this in a way that can feel almost unfair, because it means the exact same touch from the exact same person can land completely differently depending on what kind of day a person has had. Someone who is anxious or exhausted or already feeling a bit raw and overstimulated may experience tickling as simply too much, one more input piled onto a nervous system that has no spare capacity left to interpret ambiguous touch as playful. Someone who is relaxed and in good spirits, by contrast, may find the very same gesture from the very same hands genuinely delightful. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it means ticklishness is not really a fixed trait sitting quietly inside a person, waiting to be measured, so much as it is a kind of live reading, something closer to a mood ring than a thermometer, shifting with context in ways that can surprise even the person experiencing it. Context more broadly shapes the experience as well, and not only through mood. A tickle delivered during a pillow fight, amid laughter that was already flowing before the tickling even began, tends to be absorbed into that existing current of playfulness. The same tickle delivered in a tense moment, or in front of people the ticklish person doesn't know well, or right after an argument, can feel entirely different, sometimes not funny at all, sometimes closer to an intrusion than an invitation. Culture plays a role here too, in ways that are harder to pin down with tidy research, but easy enough to notice anecdotally, since different families and different communities carry different unspoken rules about how much physical teasing is normal, who is allowed to initiate it, and at what age it starts to feel inappropriate rather than affectionate. Then there is the broader question of tactile sensitivity itself, the way skin,
and the nervous system reading signals from skin is not identical from one person to the next. Some people report being generally more sensitive to light touch of all kinds, not just tickling but the brush of a clothing tag, the seam of a sock, the sensation of someone resting a hand gently on their forearm. Others report the opposite, a kind of general dampening, where touch needs to be firmer or more textured before it registers strongly at all. It is worth being careful here and resisting the pull toward tidy diagnosis, because tactile sensitivity exists along a wide and ordinary spectrum, shaped by nervous system differences that show up across many different kinds of minds and bodies, including, but by no means limited to, various forms of neurodivergence. A person who finds certain textures overwhelming, or certain unexpected touches genuinely distressing rather than playful, is not being oversensitive in some judgmental sense. They are simply describing accurately how their own nervous system processes a particular category of input, and that description deserves to be taken at face value rather than treated as something to be argued out of. All of which leads to a point worth stating plainly, since it can get lost in a narration mostly devoted to explaining why tickling produces laughter and connection. Not everyone finds tickling pleasant, and not everyone finds it funny, and neither of those responses needs an explanation or an apology.
Some people experience tickling as pure discomfort, dressed up in a socially acceptable costume of playfulness. The laughter that emerges, if it emerges at all, closer to the reflexive kind discussed earlier than to any genuine delight, a bit like the strange body memory of a nervous laugh at a funeral, technically laughter, but not remotely a sign that anything is enjoyable. For a person like this, being told that tickling is supposed to be fun can feel oddly invalidating, as though their own honest report of their own body's response is somehow being overruled by a general rule that was never really about them in the first place. So the picture that emerges, drifting a little further into these variations, is one of enormous individual range, sitting underneath what looks, from a distance, like a single simple behavior. Age changes it, attention changes it, trust changes it, mood changes it, sometimes hour to hour. Context changes it, sometimes moment to moment, and underneath all of that sits a baseline of tactile sensitivity that seems to differ quite naturally from one nervous system to the next, the same way handwriting differs, or the way some people startle at sudden sounds far more easily than others. None of this variation needs fixing, and it sets up rather naturally the next question worth turning over slowly in the dark, which is what happens, physiologically and psychologically, in the cases where the whole system seems to misfire in a more pronounced way, where a touch meant kindly lands instead as something closer to pain, or where laughter and enjoyment come apart from each other entirely. It might be worth pausing here, gently, to clear away a few ideas about tickling that sound reasonable, that get repeated often enough to seem like settled fact, and that turn out, on closer inspection, to be a little more tangled than they first appear. Not corrections exactly, more like a slow untying of knots that formed honestly, from people trying to make sense of something strange, but that don't quite hold up once you look at them closely, the way a knot in a shoelace looks perfectly sound until you actually try to pull it apart and discover it was really two loops tangled around nothing. The first of these is the idea that tickling is, underneath everything, simply fear wearing a costume. It's an appealing explanation, tidy in the way good explanations often are, because it accounts for the vulnerable locations, the way people flinch, the way the laughter can look so much like distress. And there is something to it, certainly, since the defensive reflex woven into ticklishness clearly borrows some of its wiring from more general alarm systems in the body, the same fast pathways that make you flinch from a spider on your arm before you've consciously registered what it is. But fear alone doesn't explain the texture of the experience for most people, most of the time. A child shrieking with laughter while trying to squirm away from a parent's hands is not, in any meaningful sense, afraid of that parent. The nervous system is treating the touch as worth a heightened response, yes, sending it up the fast lane rather than the slow one, but heightened response and fear are not the same thing, any more than the alertness of watching a good plot twist unfold is the same as terror. If tickling were simply fear, it would be difficult to explain why so many people actively seek it out, why siblings tickle each other for fun, why the whole interaction so often ends in requests for more rather than desperate pleas to stop. Fear, real fear, doesn't usually get invited back for a second round 5 minutes later. A closely related tangle is the assumption that laughter, wherever it shows up, is reliable evidence of enjoyment. This one is worth sitting with for a moment, because it quietly shapes how people treat each other during tickling without anyone ever stating it out loud as a rule. The thinking goes something like this. If a person is laughing, they must be having a good time, and if they're having a good time, there's no reason to stop. But laughter is a strange and layered signal produced by more than one system in the body, and not all of those systems answer to enjoyment. There's the laughter that comes from genuine delight, warm and easy, the kind you'd choose again given the option. And there's a more reflexive laughter, produced almost mechanically by certain kinds of touch and certain kinds of overstimulation, closer to a cough or a sneeze than to a feeling. The two can sound remarkably similar from the outside, sometimes even to the person producing them, which is part of what makes the whole subject genuinely confusing rather than simple. This is why the phrase people sometimes use, tickled to tears, carries a little more truth in it than its casual, cheerful usage would suggest, because there really is a point past which the laughter stops tracking anything like pleasure and starts tracking something closer to overload, the nervous system doing what it does regardless of whether the mind attached to it is still enjoying the ride. A person laughing hard while gasping out the word "stop" is not sending a mixed message. They are sending two honest signals from two different systems, and the reflexive one, the laughter, happens to be louder and more visible than the quieter, more deliberate one trying to get a word out between breaths. This matters beyond the tickling itself, actually, because it's a small, low-stakes example of something that shows up in bigger ways elsewhere, the general unreliability of outward expression as a perfect window into inner experience. People can laugh at things that distress them. People can cry at things that delight them. The body's expressive repertoire is smaller and more overlapping than the range of things it's trying to express, so a certain amount of mismatch is built in, unavoidable, and none of it means anyone is lying, including to themselves. The third knot worth loosening is one that's been circling under the surface of this whole narration without being named directly until now, and it's the idea that people simply cannot tickle themselves, full stop, as though it were a hard physical law, like not being able to see behind your own head without a mirror. It's often stated that way, cannot, absolute,
but the science underneath it is a good deal softer than that word suggests. What actually seems to happen is not an impossibility, but a dampening, a substantial and consistent reduction in the ticklish response when the touch is self-generated, rather than a complete erasure of it. The brain's prediction machinery, the same cerebellar forecasting discussed earlier in this narration, does a genuinely good job of anticipating the exact timing, pressure, and path of a touch you produce yourself, and that anticipation quiets the response considerably. But quiets is not the same as silence is. Under the right conditions, people can still register something from self-produced touch, particularly when the predictability is disrupted in some way, when a delay is introduced between the motion of the hand and the resulting sensation, or when a mechanical device is used to translate the person's own movements into a touch that no longer maps quite so neatly onto what the brain expected. Researchers studying this exact question, tinkering with robotic tickling arms in laboratories, found that as they added small delays or slight changes in direction between a person's self-directed movement and the touch that followed, the ticklish sensation crept back in, gradually, in proportion to how badly the prediction failed to match the outcome. That's a very different picture from a simple switch that's either on or off. It's closer to a dimmer, one that mostly gets turned down low by self-prediction, but that can be nudged back up when the prediction stops being trustworthy. And that leads to the last of these tangles, which is perhaps the most easily misunderstood of all, the assumption that this predictive dampening means the brain is somehow consciously calculating, in real time, every last detail of an upcoming touch before it happens. It's tempting to imagine some small internal narrator keeping a precise, itemized list, this many grams of pressure, this exact path across the skin, arriving at this precise moment, checked off against the incoming sensation like an inspector with a clipboard. But that's not really what's happening, or at least not in any way available to conscious awareness. The forecasting done by the cerebellum is not a thought. It happens well beneath the level of anything you could describe or narrate to yourself, in the same automatic register as the adjustments your body makes to stay balanced while walking on uneven ground, adjustments so continuous and so unconscious that you'd struggle to even name them individually if asked. You don't decide to dampen the sensation of your own touch any more than you decide to dilate your pupils in a dim room. The whole system runs quietly in the background, generating expectations and comparing them to reality, all without asking your conscious mind for permission or even much in the way of attention, and the discomfort or ease you eventually feel, if you feel anything worth naming at all, arrives already shaped by work you had no hand in directing and very little access to observing. So the truer story, once these small myths are cleared away, turns out to be less like a set of hard rules and more like a soft topography, full of gradients rather than switches, tendencies rather than absolutes. Fear plays a part, but isn't the whole engine. Laughter is a signal, but not a perfectly honest one. Self-tickling is muted, but not erased. Prediction shapes sensation, but does so silently, without narration, without a decision ever quite being made. And it's that last thread, the quiet, decision-free machinery, running underneath so much of ordinary bodily experience, that seems worth following a little further, into the stranger territory of what happens when that machinery, usually so reliable, starts to falter or run in unexpected directions.
There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a person when they stop trying to catch a sensation before it happens, and just let it happen instead. And that quiet is really what this whole long unwinding has been circling around from the very start. Because underneath the specific, small mystery of why a hand can't surprise the arm it's attached to, there's a much larger and much older question, one that every nervous system on the planet has had to answer just to survive its first few days of existence. And the question is simply this: where do I end, and where does the world begin? It sounds almost too basic to ask out loud, the kind of thing a person assumes was settled long before memory even started. But it isn't obvious at all. Not really. Not biologically. A newborn doesn't arrive already knowing the edges of its own body. It has to learn them, the way you might learn the layout of a house in the dark, by bumping into things, by noticing which sensations vanish the moment attention moves away and which ones persist no matter what. A kick against the inside of a womb wall, felt from both sides at once, is one of the earliest lessons in this, though of course no memory of it survives into adulthood. Later, a hand meeting a face in the crib teaches the same lesson again, more clearly. Touch something that isn't you, and the feeling is single, arriving from one direction only. Touch yourself, and the feeling doubles, arrives from two directions that match perfectly, that agree with each other, down to the instant. That doubling, that agreement, is one of the very first pieces of evidence a young nervous system collects about its own boundaries, and it keeps collecting evidence like it for years, quietly, without any dramatic announcement, until the boundary feels less like a discovery and more like a fact that was simply always true. Self-tickling failing to work is a distant descendant of that same early lesson, still running, still quietly checking, decades later, whether a given sensation carries the signature of self or the signature of other. It's not tickling alone that depends on this ancient sorting mechanism. Nearly everything does. The reason a person can walk through a crowded room without flinching at every brush of fabric against their own arm, while flinching instantly if a stranger's hand does the same thing, comes from this same underlying architecture. The reason you can grip your own hand tightly, dig your own fingers in, press quite hard, and still register it as pressure rather than as an alarming intrusion, comes from this same architecture too. The nervous system is, in a very real sense, constantly asking a background question about every signal that arrives. Did I cause this, or did something else? And most of the time, the answer is settled so quickly, so far beneath conscious notice, that a person never even suspects the question was asked at all. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes the whole subject in a gentler light. The failure to tickle yourself isn't really a limitation, a bug in an otherwise clever design. It's closer to a form of quiet housekeeping, the nervous system continuously sorting incoming information into self-generated and world-generated, so that attention, which is a genuinely limited resource, doesn't have to be spent verifying the obvious 100 times a minute. Imagine if it worked the other way, if every sensation, no matter its source, arrived with full and undiminished force, indistinguishable from something unexpected. The scrape of your own sleeve against your wrist would compete for attention with the sudden touch of another person. The weight of your own hand resting on your own knee would register with the same startle-worthy intensity as a tap on the shoulder from someone standing behind you unseen. Life under those conditions would be, if not impossible, at least exhausting in a very particular way, a life spent perpetually flinching at yourself. So the muting of self-generated touch, the fact that it arrives, softened, familiar,
easy to overlook, is part of a much larger and much older strategy for staying sane inside a body that is constantly producing its own noise. And touch is only one small corner of this. The same filtering shows up in vision, where the world doesn't appear to lurch and blur every time the eyes dart from one point to another, even though the image striking the retina is, in a strictly optical sense, smearing rapidly with every movement. It shows up in hearing, in the way a person's own voice, heard from inside their own skull, sounds different and somehow less startling than a recording of that same voice played back afterward. A difference many people notice with a small jolt of surprise the first time they hear themselves on tape. It shows up in the way you can chew, swallow, breathe, blink, shift in a chair, all without each of these ordinary self-produced events, triggering the kind of alert reserved for something arriving from outside. Underneath conscious experience, an enormous and largely invisible amount of prediction and cancellation is running at all times, filtering out the self so that what remains standing out, what actually claims attention, tends to be the world. There's something almost moving about this, once it's laid out plainly.
So much of what feels like a settled, obvious sense of being a single, continuous person moving through a stable world turns out to be the product of ceaseless, silent labor, forecasting sensations before they happen and quietly subtracting expected ones so that only the surprising remains vivid. Nobody trains for this. Nobody studies for it. It simply builds itself in early life and then keeps running, unattended, for the rest of a person's days, only occasionally revealing its existence through small edge cases, like the failure of a hand to tickle its own arm, or through stranger and rarer situations where the filtering goes slightly wrong, where a person's own thoughts or movements are mistakenly tagged as coming from outside, and the everyday, unnoticed machinery of self-recognition briefly shows its seams. Most people never encounter those edge cases directly. Most people only ever meet this machinery through its ordinary, reliable output, a life that simply feels stable, feels bounded, feels like it belongs to one continuous someone, rather than dissolving at every turn into an undifferentiated wash of sensation. It's a strange kind of comfort, thinking about it this way, lying still with the evening settling in. All day, a quiet system has been keeping watch, sorting the felt world into what came from you and what came from elsewhere, not because you asked it to, not because you could have done the job yourself even if you'd tried, but simply because that is what a nervous system does, patiently, endlessly, without any need for gratitude or acknowledgement. It has been predicting the small sounds of your own footsteps, dampening the ordinary drag of clothing against skin, softening the weight of your own hands where they rest against each other or against the sheets, so that what stands out, what actually reaches the surface of awareness, is mostly what matters, mostly what's new, mostly what deserves the attention it receives. Even the small unresolved oddities along the way laughter sometimes appears without real amusement behind it, the way a machine or another person's hand can occasionally slip past the usual filtering, the way children seem to hold on to a wider window of surprise than adults typically do, are not failures of this system so much as glimpses of how finely tuned and how endlessly working it actually is underneath the surface. And now, with all of that turned over and set gently aside, there's nothing left to do but notice your own body again, simply, without analysis, the weight of it against whatever is holding it up, the small, steady rise and fall of breath, moving in and out without instruction, without a decision made anywhere you could point to. The quiet, background hum of a nervous system doing what it has always done, sorting, predicting, softening, letting the day's noise fade, so that what's left is just this,
stillness, and the slow, unremarkable, entirely ordinary miracle of a body that knows, without ever needing to be told, exactly where it ends and the rest of the world begins. Rest well.